Just want to say thank you to everyone and your participation today in my presentation. I have figured out a way to clone myself, it seems, because now there's about 5 Stephanies in the participant list, which just makes me really happy. I shared my my registration link, so Elise, thank you for accommodating that. So as Elise has mentioned, this is an interactive presentation. And I encourage you to join me by scanning the QR code or by entering on menti.com the code that you see on the screen. It is very much an interactive presentation today. I am looking to get your feedback and your thoughts throughout as we're talking about advertisements, mediatization, and racialization and food insecurity today. It looks like in the comments it says you can rename yourselves as well if you like. So if you want to identify yourself by name, you can go ahead and do that under the Zoom function. So I'm actually going to not be monitoring the chat during my presentation just because of the interactivity of this presentation style, but I will at the end get to the chat function, and I'll be leaning on our conference organizers to also help facilitate the discussion at the end. So without further ado, I will assume that everybody is in, and if you're not, no worries. Throughout the presentation at the top, you'll be able to see the code. Before I continue, there just seems to be, there we go, a little bit of a delay. I mentioned that I am joining you from Ottawa today, and before I proceed in identifying our agenda for this presentation, I do want to acknowledge and begin by acknowledging that the land in which I am on is traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This land has been with the Algonquin people since time immemorial, and I'm very grateful and privileged to have the opportunity to present in this territory today. I encourage you to take 10 seconds, if you will, to acknowledge the land in which you're joining us today in this presentation as well. Our agenda for this afternoon will be to contextualize overall the advertising context in which we live in, very briefly, and for me to introduce you to the mediatization concepts and theories that are new, relatively new, but are picking up quite swiftly in speed in the communication and media studies realm. And I will be introducing you quite briefly as well to my overall thesis design, which connects these concepts overall in terms of food insecurity, mediatization, and advertising. I welcome my professor and my supervisor, Professor Ivanov, who is joining us today. So hopefully I don't shoot myself in the foot about what I'm going to say. I had a bit of a funny experience yesterday with my laptop basically going up in smoke. So I hope, Professor, that that's not indicative of any foreshadowing of what my thesis is going to be like. And that was a true story. I am using a laptop for my partner, who is also in the room today. So without further ado, our first interactive activity, and I see that some people have already joined. Thank you for putting yourselves in here, for being vulnerable enough to participate alongside me. I see a lot of people are joining here. I've got 11 folks. I'm just going to give that a short 10-second opportunity for you to input your information on this slide, because ultimately we will be doing a little quiz. So there's a leaderboard at the end if you're motivated to have bragging rights by any means. I give you the full right to do that, although this doesn't really mean anything in the long run. So let's begin. The first, I want to get your general feel in terms of identifying brands, and this is going to help contextualize where we are at in terms of our advertising context. So on the screen, you will see, and if you're joining on your phone or on the web browser, you will see some logos popping in. And I just want you to answer the questions that are prompting you there. So who is this? How do we know who this is? By their logo. Amazing. We got Microsoft, we've got Windows. The name really doesn't matter at the end of the day. We know who this is. I might have skipped Apple as the first one. That's okay. We're all familiar in terms of what that looks like. We're going to move into the third one for this presentation. Just making it a little bit harder for you to identify, see who in this room is working with the community. There's 7 seconds left on this one. Amazing. We've got a little bit of a variety of responses. That's perfectly okay. Part of this is to identify who here is familiar with these organizations, but the correct answer is in fact United Way, which is a very strongly sponsored nonprofit organization here, especially with the Government of Canada. So if you have any influence or any experience in that with the GCWCC, then that's where perhaps you have seen that. And second last, we're just going to make this a little challenging even more. Here's where my foodies can actually come in and let me know where you're at. It is a tough one, I will say. Michelin star, no idea. Yeah, perfectly fine. Michelin star, highly motivated in the food and beverage industry. We see the Michelin star as being kind of the pinnacle of what chefs all around the world work towards in being able to get recognition in the international stage. And last but not least, and no, it is not a fork and a spoon. This does belong to a brand. It does belong to a charity partner. I will give you a hint on that one. So not a fork and a spoon. You got it. Yeah. Food Bank. That is in fact the logo for the Food Bank of Canada. Now, why is this relevant? I'm going to get to that in a minute. First, let's just see what's happening on the leaderboard. I think my partner has a bit of an advantage having seen this presentation at least once or twice. So kudos to you for winning that and at least just participating with me on that. Now, I want to talk about a little bit of why this even matters. Why are we doing this kind of identification today? And part of it is logos have this kind of beautiful way to go beyond traditional communication boundaries. There is no need to be in any determined space or time when it comes to how brands and companies communicate directly with us. That kind of exchange in terms of persuasive communication really plays a role as well in our emotional and social and psychological effects. And a lot of these brands use these and leverage these techniques to have emotional appeals, to encourage us to buy, to participate with them. It's well established today that the identity of brands is co-created between the brand itself and the interaction of their audience. And it results in the overall customer being part of the brand identity. They are now framed as being protagonists as part of the brand. Social media space is almost impossible to see these kind of larger accounts that aren't being sponsored. And you can quickly see that by who they're tagging and what's happening kind of in the comment section of physical people, right? So the customer and community-centric approach puts the user as the main protagonist, as I've mentioned, and these new insights of this paradigm change are really a result of how technology has shifted to a 24/7 access. I do want to also emphasize the fact that brands and the way in which visual and textual representations are made It is very much part of culture creation. We're talking about the social construction through communicative action. That's how we engage with symbols. That's how we formulate these kind of visual narratives in our world and in our space. There was a research study that I found that focused a lot on the evolution of this space in the research. And a Scopus database search will quickly reveal that there's over 1,200 articles published in the last 5 years, primarily focusing on brand personality, brand identity, specifically within the advertising realm. Now, if I contextualize specifically food insecurity in this advertising space, there's quite a lot of money that's spent in the marketing of energy dense and nutrient poor foods. There's about $2 billion, that's that value that you see there on the screen, of how much money is actually going into that space of advertising, specifically within food. Now that equates to about 5,000 advertisements per year of just food advertisements that we are exposed to. That said, advertisements as a whole, when we look at it holistically, we see that our exposure is about 5,000 per day. So I encourage you to even look around the room in which you're in, the clothes that you wear. Literally all of the things in our existence are branded in some form or fashion to promote essentially the organizations. I'm going to take a step back just for a second and share a bit of a personal story here. You see a picture of waffles, but really what I see and what I smell is cinnamon and sugar. I have this very vivid memory from when I was about 6 years old in smelling waffles in my school, because I was part of the breakfast club in my elementary school here in Ottawa. And this is a very intimate topic for me. Of course, part of the passions that I have behind this theme is in relation to my very personal experience with food insecurity. My family is a Latinx family. Our backgrounds stem from El Salvador and Costa Rica. And the Ottawa community really helped us tremendously in being able to establish ourselves here in this city. This is where they've decided to create that opportunity for our family. I bring up this story mainly to contextualize a little bit of, I think, what a lot of individuals share and can resonate with what I'm saying. If you are a racialized community, I think here we have to understand too contextually that a lot of racialized communities are in fact marginalized continuously, systematically, perhaps, you know, not as overt as what we see, but it is still very much baked into the systematic infrastructure of the way our society is organized. And food insecurity very much has a relationship with marginalized communities and them being essentially the first of the, and kind of leading in needing to access food banks across Canada. Critical race theory is important here, and I wish to identify that as kind of a bit of a framework as to what's motivating me to also look at this kind of intersectional lens. Critical race theory holds that racism is a normal, enduring aspect of how society conducts itself and is deeply embedded in the culture of institutions, including political, economic, legal, educational, and other systems in society. You might have heard about critical race theory in the press recently, not for good things, but this is primarily in the US, where critical race theory is being banned as a teaching in certain states. And why I believe this is important really to talk about these issues, as uncomfortable as they make us feel, is that this intersectional lens in practice really, in an empirical sense, is meant to shed light on the issues that face that racialized demographics face on the day-to-day. Here I am encouraging at least our institution at the University of Ottawa to challenge what we see and those kind of white Western Anglo-Saxon representational ideals that are very prominent in all aspects of our society. The reason I believe that looking at intersectionality and some of these theoretical frameworks like critical race theory, why that's important is because of the mediated power structures that are built into society. And I believe that by being able to look at this in tandem when we're evaluating the perpetual struggles of marginalized groups, that we'll be able to see subsequently how visual and textual narratives in public campaigns and advertisements affect these groups. So another quick exercise for you to join me in. Here, your screen or your phone should be prompting you for 3 entries. I would like for you to keep your entries to 1 word if possible. The question today that I'm posing to you is, what is media? Very generic topic. You can take it however you wish in terms of whatever angle you wish. But the idea here is for you to punch in a series of ideas, thoughts, whatever comes to mind for you, and in terms of how media is defined. I'll give you about 10, 15 seconds for you to punch in your thoughts. Looks like I've got 2 people in, 3 people in. Thank you so much for your participation. Controversial, it's a really good word. Infotainment, amazing. That should be a coin term. If it's not, somebody get on it. Social promoting, biased, excellent. Depression, that's also a very strong and very telling word of how we perceive media to be. Gatekeepers, we have music, thank you. There's some categorical forms of media that we're seeing here. Now, the idea behind this exercise, of course, is to position and contextualize our relationship with media. You can see that here there's various perspectives already in this room in terms of how we can define media overall. And it really does depend on your angle and your take on this. You could look at the infrastructure of media and the broadcasting of media through infrastructure. You can look at it in terms of what the perceptions are of the content itself, what kind of feelings it's promoting in us. You could look at the actual categories of media itself. I don't think that a presentation in communications is necessarily able to remove itself from Marshall McLuhan's quote, which is extremely influential in the communications world. He's a Canadian communication theorist who celebrated this quote and his work in 2014. It was his 50th anniversary for this. But really, why the medium is the message is such an important foundational phrase for my research as well, is that it speaks to the omnipresent media and the way in which media infiltrates our psyche every day, either actively or passively. I think most arguably that media is profoundly shaping and reshaping our daily lives. It shapes our cultural beliefs. It shapes the ways in which we see the world. It shapes our interaction with each other. And I'll share another quick story about why I think this is also important and how that plays a role into how I perceive media. I was probably around 14 in school. This is now, I guess, high school, here again locally and in Stittsville. I think the context is important to also position where the story is coming from. But someone in my class, a peer, turned to me and just intelligently accused me and my family of being essentially escape artists of prisons, of Mexican prisons. And it was actually a really, probably the first most explicit form of racial aggression that I felt as a child, although I wouldn't necessarily be able to call it what it was. But the funny thing that this peer didn't know is that my parents were in fact in prison, and they were in fact in a Mexican prison, but we're not Mexican. And what this individual didn't realize is that my family really in their quest, if I shall call it that, for opportunity, really chose to look at the Western world as the answer for their children and for their family. That meant walking and busing and traveling to the land that they thought could offer them safety, security, and education. And they were set pretty much on the US, but they were caught. They were caught in Mexico and sent back. Essentially, my family was fleeing prosecution for having peripheral participation in the civil uprising in El Salvador. So I think the context is very important in terms of why my family was in prison. It wasn't for reasons for why I think my peer assumed, and I couldn't blame him, because at the end of the day, the child who, and my peer who was in that room with me, didn't have any kind of other example of Latinx culture or what it actually meant to be part of this culture. I couldn't accuse him of having these biases and almost without really looking at the root of where I believe a lot of these narratives come from, which is media. And even to this day, I would say that I would be hard pressed to point you to, beautifully produced artworks with the same breadth and depth that's offered to the Western and Anglo-Saxon culture. It's hard to find thematics that drive you away from the narcotics and the cartels of Latin America. The medium truly is the message, and I say this because like I mentioned earlier, this is not necessarily just an experience of mine. This is an experience, I think, that is shared by many within racialized communities. These assumptions of who we are, what we represent, based on what images and dialogistic practices are happening between media and society. There is research and empirical evidence to support that there is systematic racism and censorship in media. And this is within the Canadian sphere of media. This study that you see here, Kukier et al., that was published in 2009, revealed the lasting effects of inadequate representation of individuals, racialized individuals, in legitimate and authoritative roles. They evaluated about 251 episodes of 3 prominent Canadian television shows in this study, and found that more often than not, racialized individuals who are considered experts were not necessarily given the same space to articulate their knowledge and mobilize that knowledge to others. Just a point on media beyond what Marcia McLuhan was saying, and I think is relevant in today's conversation, is that media acts as those conduits. It acts as the language, it acts as the environment in which we operate within. And this brings me to the introduction of this next topic. Mediatization might be something that you're new to today. It might be something that's a refresher for you if you're joining me from the communications spheres of knowledge, but really it is a birth of a new concept within media studies, in that it articulates the constant exchange of information by way of communicating from media to and between society. So that story that I'm telling you about of my peer, that's where I first was exposed to what those stereotypes looked like, what narratives were being told of my own culture. I think it's important to also evaluate that in mediatization, there is a very strong view of this entrenchment of power and a significant influence in sociocultural evolution. I think it's extremely hard to divorce ourselves from these power structures, and also how media plays a role in facilitating our knowledge around all of the spaces within society. Livingstone and Coldry are quite large contributors to this body of knowledge. Martin Barbero, who is a Latin American scholar as well, gave birth to the idea of media in relation to mediations. And that's where we come into this mediatization general concept that we hear of. And there is a bit of a lost in translation aspect of this as well, because of translations coming in from Europe, German in particular. And so arguably there are other ways in which we can call this, but for the purpose of today and for the research that I am leaning into, mediatization is essentially the overall name of this theory. I want to turn to you one more time and see, just in relation, before we start digging into how this is all connected for my thesis, I want to understand what food insecurity means to you. Again, you'll be prompted with 3 words, if I'm not mistaken. If you can try to keep your concepts to just one overarching word, that would be amazing. And I'll give you some time to just percolate some thoughts and see what your relationship is with food insecurity, but also how you think it should be defined. Great. We've got 1 answer in here, 4 popping up. Great. Thank you so much for participating. It is a bit of a strong topic for today, but we are, I think, in need of being able to unpack a lot of the multifaceted aspects of this. And I'm seeing that some people are defining this as a financial problem. Absolutely. Economics plays a massive role in that. Wages play a massive role in how food security is framed. We've got hunger, non-Canadian. That's a very big one. When we conceptualize food insecurity, what do we see? What do we know in terms of who it affects? Is it us versus them? Is it Canadian? Is it truly a Canadian issue, or is it not in my backyard? We've got instability, immigrant, dependence, need, shame, unfair, absolutely, and a violation of human rights. So what? So we've looked at media, we've looked at a little bit of the context of the advertising sphere, definitely not thoroughly in any form or fashion. There is a significant amount of literature, as I mentioned, in the advertising space, in the media studies space. But the idea behind connecting these is, for me, to answer exactly this. What does this actually look like in the Canadian domain? What does food insecurity, how is it defined? What does it look like? Who does it represent? And that's the biggest question of curiosity that I have as a first-year master's student going in as a premise behind my research. I'm not sure if it would shock a lot of people in this room to know that 1 in 8 households, Canadian households, are impacted by food insecurity. So chances are, with 24 participants in this room, it is affecting us. 1 of us, 2 of us, 3 of us in this room. I think also by understanding how the socioeconomic status of racialized communities in Canada, how that's affecting them, looking at a food bank's report that was released in 2021, it was unsurprising to see that our Indigenous communities here in Canada are reporting 28% more of having to access food banks in Canada over their white counterparts. And I think part of this too is that the pandemic is playing a massive role in terms of how food security is and the conversation around this is happening. So what do we do about this? You'll see a couple of bylines and headers here from articles taken from CBC. These aren't old articles. These are recent from within the last 2 months. You'll notice the date of December 7th on here. Again, this is all within the Canadian context. Conversations that are happening in the press. As recent as yesterday, I saw an article regarding what this actually looks like in terms of how it's afflicting the Canadian population. Now, if you think that this can't possibly affect me now, or perhaps in this current space, contextually, you have the securities and the privileges afforded to you to be able to access food. Well, the truth of the matter is that research is highlighting that even as recent as, or as close as I should say, February and March of this year, that food prices in grocery stores will be increasing between 5 and 7%. I mentioned a couple of factors in terms of what is impacting this. Wages in the agriculture sector is certainly one of them. Climate change, most definitely. Accessibility overall in terms of the types of food. Food theft is another one in terms of actual taking of food from the grocery stores, not paying for it. And I'm pretty sure that this freedom convoy is not helping either when it comes to the supply chain. I mentioned the pandemic before, and I think that that also has accelerated the pace beyond the factors that we've seen here. And I think with this in mind, this is where I get to introduce to you a little bit of my research and how I'm trying to bridge a lot of these factors, all of these kind of, I think, foundational concepts, rather, that I would like to say. So I will be focused primarily, again, this is all in the works, so there might be some pivots as I progress in dialogue with my supervisor, as I continue to just expand on this idea, as I continue to read literature. But what I'm introducing to you today is kind of the overall premise of my research. I will be heavily focused on the critical paradigms, that is, analyzing existing systems in an inductive methodology, and really looking at visual content and textual content and leveraging content analysis that allows me to look at imagery, look at the texts and the narratives, and formulate thematics around what's happening. So I will be, of course, leaning into the space of mediatization literature, some of which you've been introduced to today, but some very, I would say, prominent and influential characters, even within the University of Ottawa's context. We have Professor McCurdy. I'm not sure if he's in the room today, but I will be leaning into previous studies that were conducted by the oil sands and the climate change crises, and how some of these thematic narratives have evolved over time to frame these issues to Canadians for their participation and engagement in these issues. I hope to position advertisements as a media form. Of course, there's likely research already that does this. This isn't hopefully anything new, but the goal overall is to analyze digital campaigns and advertisements by select food charities here in Canada within the span of about 4 years. There's a bit of a shift in terms of my time period, but based on conversations recently with my supervisor, I think what I hear is to be as thorough as I can, just contributing to the body of knowledge of mediatization in relation to racialized communities and food insecurity. I think it would be worthwhile exercise in looking at a period of 4 years, that is to say 2 years previous to the pandemic and 2 years during, now that we're close to our 2-year mark here in Canada. As I mentioned, I will be coding and developing a coding schema that looks at the communicative context that was offered by Hansen and Machen, and also looking at the cultural context of racialized communities by way of their skin color. I do want to leave you with a few questions, hopefully for your participation. I'm sure that I did see on the last slide that somebody had a question regarding the thesis overall, and I'm sure there are many opportunities to discuss about that, the approach, the overall methodology, how things are going to happen. And I absolutely entertain the deconstruction of my thesis so I can build it back up as strongly as I possibly can to contribute to knowledge here at the university. But I leave you with these questions just to promote some discussion. And I thank you for your time today in allowing me some space into your psyche as well with these concepts, and with sharing with you a little bit of my story. Thank you overall just in listening, and I'll pass the mic to our moderator.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie, for that amazing presentation. I was very engaged and felt my emotions coming to the forefront on some of your slides. So at this point, did anybody have any questions or, okay, yeah, Michelle, go for it.
1 second. Hey, thanks. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm wondering, we often, I think in Canada, differentiate between, or we think about food insecurity, especially in the context of like isolated areas or northern communities, and like that in access to food because of geographical limitations, or there aren't the stores or that kind of access. And then we differentiate that with kind of like poverty driven food insecurity, and kind of one happens in these isolated areas and isn't necessarily correlated with poverty, and the other one is directly correlated with poverty and happens in urban areas. And so I'm wondering how that factors into what you're thinking about. I don't know, I think there's racial issues for both of those. I don't know, that would be interesting to look at.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. I always appreciate your comments. And I know you and I could have like conversations for hours about this stuff. Yeah. But I think you raise a really good point. It is geographically, it is something that I have been looking at. It was something that I exercised as part of a research proposal and Professor Dubois' research methods class, in terms of looking at how Statistics Canada essentially breaks down geographically the populations within Canada, and who has what we call as urban centers and what we call as remote and rural. I think there is something there, as you mentioned, in terms of how many food charities are actually prevalent in these communities, and also how they interact with their communities depending on the size and the geographical location of the cities and the communities in which they're in. I don't know firsthand right now to be able to answer your question, but definitely something that I've been considering in terms of how to select overall my criteria for which food charities will be involved in this study. It is something that I'm looking to expand on in further conversations, but I welcome, of course, any other ideas and conversations related to that. It was a really good observation. Of course, I think it would impact the way we interact with this issue overall as a society. I'm not sure if that answers your question or if you have another.
No, I don't know that I had a specific question. It was more, I guess, just a context or my instinct as I've encountered kind of the term food insecurity in my own life as a, I don't know, urban Canadian, that I often think about it as, you know, access to fresh foods in the north or access to food supply chains. And and maybe we need to, I need to rethink my idea of what food insecurity means in urban areas, or whether those are, and whether both are the same sides of one coin, or whether they're completely different issues. So, I mean, you're right, it's more of an observation, I guess, or than a direct question.
But a very welcomed one, because part of it too is how do we define this issue? And I think very similarly to your your efforts in being able to define journalism, it's such a broad category. You know, there's so many things that are going to feed into this definition. Are we only looking at the cost of food, or the factors that lead up to food insecurity? Really, what is it at the end of the day? It's a really welcomed observation. I see Seikot. I'm sorry if I did not pronounce that properly.
Yeah, no, you actually got it. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. It was really good. And yeah, to that point, I think, I don't know how this adds to what you're searching, but I totally agree. I think it's a really broad state, like food insecurity. Everyone has a different viewpoint of what it is, and viewpointing the accessibility issues so many folks face, where I think when we think of food banks, for example, we always see them in very urbanized areas, bigger cities like Toronto, Ottawa. And just, I think, obviously it's hard to come up with it, but pinpointing this, like the rural areas in terms of accessibility, how food banks are actually trying to access them, whether it's transportation in more rural areas. Let's say someone doesn't have access to a car or transportation. How can we pinpoint transportation to food insecurity and making sure people actually have the resources to go where they need to go? And yeah.
Very good observation, Seikot. Yeah, and I think you're right. Accessibility plays a role. I think it is a factor in who has access to what foods. More recently, a publication that I saw, this was in the press, of course, CBC seems to be the one that I lean on the most. And this was just as recent as yesterday, in identifying how areas, if you're familiar with Ottawa, areas like Hintonburg, what happens with the factors of gentrification and how does that impact food insecurity overall? These areas of Hintonburg where I used to live and no longer live because it is unaffordable for one person to be living in these kinds of areas. We're talking boutique grocery stores. These aren't necessarily budget-friendly grocery stores. And so that limits the access for someone like me, as an example, to be able to diversify where I actually get my food. And that's a very, very important point. Michelle.
In response to that, this is kind of like tying the two thoughts together, but I also wonder on the question of access, especially in smaller communities where food insecurity is thought of more as perhaps an access issue over a poverty issue, maybe it's addressed in a different way when you don't have kind of food banks or charitable groups who are responding. Like perhaps the community itself responds kind of individually and under the radar in ways that aren't really captured or even aren't thought of as addressing a food insecurity problem. They're just addressing being a good neighbor or kind of, and so it's not even captured under this paradigm.
Right. Yeah, one angle that I had been considering as well as part of my thesis was how these demographics are also positioned in relation to each other. Because it's not to say that non-racialized communities don't experience food insecurity, they very much do. So I had also thought about what that looks like visually and what I'm trying to find and some kind of the sources of information that I'll be looking at will be primarily off the food charity websites, potentially to be TBC with a giant asterisk on it. I'm not sure if I'll be looking at social platforms as well. and the different forms of media, video versus digital stills in color. So lots to figure out in terms of the overall angle. But I welcome that observation too, Michelle. Thank you. Saquon?
Yeah, sorry. Just one more thought I forgot to add in. I think also like the socioeconomic stigma of families going to these food banks, for example, where I think we forget how hard it is, for example, for a family to go to the food bank. What if they get judged in their communities? And just making sure that it's open to them and there isn't any judgments. Because I think there, in terms of the demographics, we raise the numbers of how much homelessness, how many folks have trouble accessing food, but there's a lot of folks who don't even want to involve themselves just because there's that socioeconomic stigma of actually asking for help when people are going through tough times.
Of course, and that's acknowledged, absolutely. And if there's anything that we have to do better in, as well as being able to be uncomfortable and be comfortable in that space of being able to identify these, I would be hard pressed even in this room to not acknowledge our student base in terms of how significant the cost of living is and how many factors as well our student base faces in being able to manage a full-time graduate studies or non-graduate studies, in addition to working and being able to have the right nutritional food to be fed to feed our minds so that we can actually be available to have these kinds of discussions. So I look at, there are certain demographics, I think that it's kind of an obvious truth, and we are okay, I think, with certain populations and in recognizing those barriers. But you're absolutely right. I think when I hear the statistics of 1 in 8 households and I look at how many people are in this room, to be able to stand up and say that, yes, in fact, this is something that afflicts my family, and I am having to lean into community social service spaces to have that support. That's not necessarily, I think, commonplace enough in the day-to-day. But it's, I think, even more important, and I encourage everyone here to look at the 2021 Food Bank Hunger Count Report. It was just released with data, recent data from 2020 and 2019. But the uptake of services in food banks, especially in the pandemic, has been quite significant. So we're not just seeing this within certain demographics like students anymore. We're seeing this really be a very ubiquitous problem in the Canadian population.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and just comment on that. In the realm of students, I know around here in our elementary and secondary schools, they have lunch programs or breakfast programs. In the elementary grades, it's a basket of snacks that comes in, and students can, if they want to take a snack, they're welcome to take a snack. If they don't want to, they don't have to. And it's open to all students, and probably a way to help students who actually need that help because they didn't have lunch to bring to school, or they only had one lunch piece instead of multiple snacks for all their snack breaks, to make it less apparent the need versus the want. But then you get to high school and there's a stigma attached to it. And I think our schools in this area do a good enough job. And high school kids can always hide behind the mask of, oh, I slept and like the bus was there and I just like threw my clothes on to get the bus on time, so I didn't have time to eat. Not, I didn't have food in my house, so I couldn't eat before coming to school. And then at the post-secondary level, the narrative of starving student and living on ramen, and it's kind of been made into a joke and commonplace, and we've accepted it instead of saying, well, no, like our help shouldn't just end just because someone's in higher education and can maybe afford to pay tuition for a degree. They should be able to afford food. Well, no, if all of our money is going to tuition and living, we're probably not getting the best nutrition, and this is a problem.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate your comment, and thank you for your perspective. I think part of it, you're right, is that there is an acceptance kind of, you know, amongst the institutions in terms of who this affects. And I think it's a very aware, at least from the people that I interact in my network, my more immediate spaces of influence, I see that there is this kind of narrative and this rhetoric of just an acceptance of that's just the way it is, and that's just the challenges and the barriers that you go through as a student. And I would be curious to hear from the professors who, you know, in their kind of journey to becoming a professor, what that actually looked like for them, and likely no different. But the problem that I see there too, Elise, is that the cost of living has gone up. The wages haven't also matched the cost of living. And then there's additional barriers in terms of regulations of how many hours of work you can actually work while you're in school. Of course, there's ways around that in terms of getting departmental permission to work beyond 10 hours. But 10 hours at the end of the day, I'm not sure is sufficient enough wage to even afford 2 grocery bills in the grand scheme of things in the graduate level. So yes, I think it is something that we need to have more dialogue around within our institutions and how that's impacting students. And I appreciate that comment so much.
Yeah, of course. And kind of what you said too, the statistics of food banks being more accessed in the last couple of years, that I think kind of triggered my thinking of, well, if kids aren't at school, then that food's not being donated and those kids aren't getting that food that maybe they got at school and they could get by with what they had at home. And now families are having to turn more. It's not a new problem. It was there all along and there were other resources being utilized, but it's still a problem that we need to fix across the board.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think where I lean into hope a little bit in this space is that because I, for my own mental health and my own sake and soundness of mind, the amount of readings that I do that send me in existential crises is like a daily thing. But if I could leave with a message of hope here, is that the conversations are happening, and the pandemic has really brought to the surface these kinds of underlying systematic barriers that were always in existence. They were working the way they were intended to work, especially within the racialized communities in the continual marginalization of these groups. But we're here and we're having this conversation. And what I'm seeing is that the press is picking up a lot more within this context that we're all living in, that this is in fact a problem that can no longer be ignored. I see Meredith, Professor Rochi, I'm so sorry if I butchered your last name, but it says you made a comment, I taught spin classes to pay my rent. It was hard. Totally. I've had 3 jobs at any given time as a student. And that's just so that I could actually afford greens and vegetables and fruits that are in fact going to be part of that 5 and 7% statistic that you saw there. One of the biggest food categories that's going to be impacted in the months to come. There's a hand up, Deanne?
Yeah, I apologize again. Sorry, I arrived a little late today and I'm looking forward. I'll listen to your presentation for sure later, because I've been working with the University Advisor on Mental Health and the Vice Dean of Students on the mental health files. And one of the things that we've talked about is food insecurity. And I just thought I would mention for anyone here, the professors, the students, everyone, there are quite a lot of funds, emergency funds available. If anyone finds themselves in a situation where they have a need for money or they're food insecure. The Vice Dean of Students recently said that there's a very generous donor that has donated funds specifically for that purpose at the university. And you know, if you're stuck and don't know where to go, you can go to the Loans and Awards office is one place, but she's invited, if people want to write Jennifer Lennox Carrion, if you know of a specific case that is, you know, has an emergency need, to let her know. So I just thought I'd mention that. And just to say there is recognition on the campus of how big an issue this can be.
Thank you, Jan. If you don't mind actually dropping a link in the chat, maybe that will also help prompt a connection to those campus resources. Maybe even just, I don't know if there's a web page or something that you can share, but that's really, really good to connect our student base and our teaching professionals here to that.
Yeah, and I've been working on a guide that other people have worked on as well. And I specifically requested we add a section on food insecurity because that was really something that I thought we had a gap there.
Thank you. That's really, really important work that you're doing. So big thanks to you and the teams that are helping you support that. Michelle, you made a comment in the chat and I want to close off with this, this comment because I hear you and I see you that non-traditional students that follow the journey into academia later in life absolutely are have different barriers in terms of costs of living and even dependents that are in their family and the need to have to navigate different life paths in older age. But I myself identify as a mature student. I come from a mixed background of different things. But if you're so interested in helping me, and I put this out there as a shameless plug, but I am looking to kick up a mature student hub at the University of Ottawa based on previous meetings, previous meeting, I should say. It was a singular meeting with Dean Key in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. But I'm looking actually for people who have this energy to want to solve this problem a little bit in identifying who our mature students are, what those non-traditional life paths are, and being able to provide support services to our demographic of students who fall into that category. So I just really wanted to do a shameless plug there. You can contact me if you're interested in kicking up this project with me. Right now it's a team of one. And I would very much love and you know, to collaborate with other students and other teachers in this space. So thank you for raising that. And over to Elise, I think I'm right on time. So thank you again to our conference organizers. These are students as well who do a lot more beyond their time allowance, I'm sure. So thank you for having me today. And I'm very privileged to be able to present to all of 25 of you that are in this room. Cheers, have a good day.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie. We appreciate having you here, and we appreciate all of our students taking time out of their very busy schedules to present and to attend and to be part of this co-creation of knowledge. And we will have to connect because that's definitely something that your initiative that we can work on through the association and feature on our CGSA website. And so we'll, another day,
Thank you.
another day, after a full weekend of rest after this event.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna stop the recording here.